Have you ever said something you really regret before? You stuck your foot in your mouth, and as soon as the words leave, you realize, oh no, I can't believe I said that. Maybe it was to your boss or another authority figure, and you have to deal with the consequences. Maybe you said something hurtful to a family member or a friend, and you have to deal with the relationship fallout. One of the greatest places that we can cause damage in our lives is with our words. Here at the Mended Collective, we believe that God has the power to heal, that through Jesus Christ, things can be different, and He does not leave us ignorant as it pertains to how to speak to each other and how to communicate with fellow people. So today, we want to consider 6 biblical principles for communication. The first principle for communication that we learn from Scripture is that we need to remember that our words matter. In Proverbs chapter 18, it tells us that life and death are in the power of the tongue. Whenever we open our mouths, we need to remember and have the mind of God to know that we have the ability to give people life and happiness and flourishing and growth by what we say, or we have the power to tear down, to kill, to bring trauma and violence and hurt in people by what we say. We can't forget this fact if we want to be effective in what we say. Think about that idea for a second, that death and life are in the power of the tongue. You know, imagine someone who has the power of life and death. We might think about a judge who's doing sentencing on someone convicted of a crime. And capital punishment is an option for that. And the judge has to decide, is this person going to get life or are they going to get death? Now, do you think that person's just going to flippantly say, well, it doesn't really matter. I'll just, take a chance either way. No, they're going to weigh that decision. They're going to think about it, and they're going to wield that power with the scrutiny and with the thoughtfulness that it deserves. In the book of Matthew, Jesus tells us that every idle word that we speak will be brought into judgment. Words shouldn't just be thrown around and used all willy-nilly. We need to be intentional because our words matter. The second principle from the Bible that we want to think about concerning how we communicate also has to do with how we think before we open our mouths. In 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter exhorts us and tells us that we shouldn't return railing for railing, but instead we should return a blessing. Now what's going on there is Peter's talking about how to respond when people don't talk to you the way they should. And what does he say? He says to plan ahead. To know that sometimes people aren't going to say things that you always like, but be prepared to give the response you need to give. I think this is a great principle that we need to keep in mind is we need to plan ahead. A lot of times when we get into trouble is when we're not thinking ahead for a situation and we come upon a situation and we just respond really quickly with something we shouldn't say. We quickly just shoot off something we haven't considered, and it's immediately that we realize when we think, oh my goodness, I shouldn't have said that. That's why we need to plan ahead. We need to be prepared for situations where people are going to say mean things to us, when people are going to be short with us. And instead of just shooting off what our flesh wants to say right off, we are prepared to say something that is helpful. The third principle for biblical communication that we want to consider is to listen. Did you catch that? To listen. Proverbs chapter 18, verse number 2 says that a fool has no desire in learning, but only that he may speak his mind. In the Bible, one of the most foolish people, or one of the descriptions of people who are foolish that you can read, is the person who doesn't listen. Now, why is that? Well, if we won't listen, we're not going to learn anything. And if we don't learn anything, then we're always going to make poor decisions. We're not going to receive the instruction we need in order to be better people. But also, a foolish person is not going to listen, and what's going to happen? Well, when we're talking with other people, if we're just waiting for them to stop talking so we can talk again, we don't know what they're saying. We might miss something really important. We might miss something that's critical that we need to hear. We might miss instruction. Or maybe they're talking and they start and say something in the very front, in the first few sentences of their response to us in that conversation, they say something and we just think about that of how we're going to respond to that thing. Well, later on as they went, they clarified what they meant or they corrected themselves. But because we weren't listening, we can quickly get ourselves into a mess. So if we want to communicate effectively, communication requires not just speaking, but listening so we know how to respond. The fourth principle for biblical communication that we want to think about is again found in Proverbs chapter 18, which, quick side note, if you want to learn a lot about that, go to that chapter. There's a lot of great things we can see. But Proverbs chapter 18, again, says to answer a matter before hearing it is folly and shame. Now think about that. To answer a matter before you hear it is folly and shame. It's foolish and shameful to give a response before we completely have all the details. And I think one really important way we can apply this is when we're talking to people, don't interrupt people. Really simple. Don't interrupt people. Because if we cut people off in the middle of their sentence, we can't hear all they have to say. They might have something else that would help illuminate. Plus, it's rude. It's arrogant. It sends the message to people that you don't really value what they have to say. It cuts people off, and when you interrupt people, a lot of times they're not going to want to talk to you. And so even if we think we've got all the right answers and we know exactly what's going on, one principle of biblical communication is to let people finish. Let people finish. And don't just wait for them to take a breath so you can jump in and say, oh, well, you stop talking. Let them completely finish. Let the air clear. And let them know that you listen and you value what they have to say, and then look to respond so that you don't respond in a foolish and shameful way. The fifth principle for communication from the Bible that we want to think about is found in Proverbs chapter 17. Now, this is a really profound and powerful passage as I think about it. It says, even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. Now, if you've ever read the book of Proverbs, even in passing, the fools don't get a very good name. A fool is one of the worst things you can be, to be ignorant, to make poor decisions, to refuse to be instructed. All these things are really bad. So a fool is not a good category in the book of Proverbs. But here they get some praise that I think is deserved. It says, even a fool, when they hold their peace, is counted wise. See, that's really incredible, because I think sometimes that I've got to say something. That the most important thing is having a response. And so when I get in a situation, I just feel like I hear people talking like, okay, but I have to say something, so I'm just going to say something. And here, what this says is that even someone who's not that wise, if they'll just hold off and not say anything, it'll keep you from saying something dumb. And so we need to remember that you don't always have to say something. That sometimes the answer is not to rattle off the first thing that comes to your mind, which is probably going to be wrong, but the answer is to pause for a moment and to think. And if you're in a conversation with someone, to say, hold on a second, let me think about that, and give it a few seconds. And if you can't come up with something, say, let me come back to that in a few days, or let me text you in a couple weeks and see what I can come up with. Because it's better to say something that is helpful and that is good after an amount of time than to quickly say something that is not pleasing to God. The last principle for biblical communication that we want to think about is found in the book of Ephesians chapter 4, verse number 29. It says to let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but only that which is good for edification, that it may minister grace to the hearer. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. Let's unpack the first part of that. Don't let any corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. So don't say things that tear people down. Okay, obviously, we want to say things that are good, and part of biblical communication is not saying bad things, but rather say things that edify. Now, edify means to build people up, to make them better people. Whenever I was in Boy Scouts, there was this principle that we always had whenever we would go to a campground, whether it was a public campground or we were camping on someone's private land, and that principle was always leave it better than you found it. Always leave it better than you found it. And that's sort of the principle that's being gotten at here whenever we talk to people. We need to leave people better than we found them. We need to have the goal and the mindset as we're talking to people, how do I make these people more like Jesus? How do I help them know Christ better? How do I help them to love God more? How do I help them be people who show the love of Jesus to the people that they're around? That's the goal, not to say things that corrupt and tear down and pull people away from God, but things that pull people closer into unity and love with God our Father. Notice the last thing that it says there, that it may minister grace to the hearer. The word grace means to have a gift that is given to you. To minister grace means that people have experienced something that is a blessing. Perhaps you've talked to someone before and you have a good conversation with them and you just get done with it. You're like, man, it was such a blessing to talk to those people. I know some people like that I love to talk to them, and I want to go up and I want to have a conversation because I know when I get done, no matter how hard what we talked about was, no matter how difficult what it was, I'm going to grow from that. I'm going to feel like they give me a gift in talking to me. We need to be those kind of people. The people that whenever people are talking to us, we aren't thinking, what can I get out of this, but what can I give to them? So maybe we could say a kind word. We could give an honest compliment, not flattery that seeks to puff people up, but an honest compliment to show where we see the goodness of God in their lives. Maybe we could encourage them with a Bible verse or a principle of the gospel and how that's living out. Maybe you could give thanks to them for something. There's all sorts of ways to do this. But let's be people who are ministering grace, who are a blessing to talk to, and are seeking to put the emphasis on other people. Thanks so much for checking out this video from the Mended Collective. We truly believe that God has the power to change how we talk, and that'll change the way we live and the world around us. If you have a biblical communication tip that you think we haven't looked at, we couldn't be exhausted today, comment that down below. Just take a second and throw in the Bible verse or the principle that helps you better relate to people and better minister grace in the way you speak. Until next time.